The beginning. Discovery on Nebraska Hill. It was late July, the kind of evening where the oppressive heat of the day started to yield to a refreshing twilight breeze. Nebraska Hill, an otherwise nondescript slice of wilderness, stood silent against the scarlet horizon. For most locals, the area was just a forgotten patch of rough terrain, ideal for quiet hikes, or the occasional deer hunter passing through. On this particular evening, however, the peaceful demeanor of Nebraska Hill was disturbed by an unsettling discovery. Jacob Riley, a 52-year-old retiree and avid birdwatcher, had strapped on his worn leather boots and slung his binocular case over his shoulder as part of his ritual evening outing. Jacob loved wandering the trails that snaked through the hill's rocky outcrops and dry brush, appreciating the stillness that always seemed to echo throughout the area. But on this evening, as he ventured further along a well-worn trail, an unusual rancid smell caught his attention. He stopped mid-step, his brow furrowing under the brim of his sun-bleached baseball cap. "What the hell is that?" he murmured to himself, instinctively pulling his bandana up to filter the air. At first he thought it could be the carcass of a mountain lion, or perhaps a deer that had fallen prey to the region's elusive predator population. But the smell was far too strong, far too human. Against his better judgment, Jacob followed the scent deeper into unmarked territory, his boots crunching softly across the gravelly dirt. The further he walked, the heavier the smell became, until it filled his nostrils and churned his stomach. Finally, barely a stone's throw beyond the bend, he froze. There, hidden among the dense thickets of brittle sagebrush, was something that didn't belong: a body. He wasn't certain at first. It could have been a pile of abandoned clothes or a lifeless animal. But the outline of what looked like a human frame, lying unnaturally still, sent a cold chill racing up his spine. Jacob dropped to one knee, hesitant yet compelled to confirm his worst fear. His heart pounded furiously against his ribcage as he used the tip of a branch to prod the object lightly. The sight that followed made him stumble back with an audible gasp. Before him lay the decomposed remains of a man, face down in the dirt. The skin, stretched taut over what remained of his form, had darkened and cracked under the sun's unrelenting heat over time. Jacob clenched his jaw at the grotesque sight, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he knew what he had to do. Fumbling through his pockets, his trembling hands pulled out his smartphone. He dialed 911, his voice breaking as he struggled to form the words. 911, what's your emergency? I think I found a body, he stammered. Out near Nebraska Hill, it's bad, real bad. Can you safely stay at the location and wait for law enforcement? I'll wait, yeah, just send someone quick. And then there was nothing but the sound of his labored breathing and the distant rustle of leaves in the dry summer wind. Within 20 minutes, the serenity of Nebraska Hill was shattered. Sirens wailed as local police officers and crime scene investigators descended upon the scene. Yellow tape transformed the rural landscape into a shockingly foreign crime scene. Officers scanned the area with flashlights and methodical precision as evidence markers began to appear against the dirt and brush. The lead investigator, Detective Carol Whitman, crouched near the body, her sharp eyes narrowing behind aviator sunglasses as she surveyed the grim tableau. "Male, mid-20s, she muttered, jotting down notes on her clipboard. "No wallet, no ID, but whoever he is, he didn't end up here by accident." The coroner on site leaned closer, carefully turning the body with gloved hands. "Decomposition suggests he's been here a week or more," they announced. "Possible signs of trauma, some bruising around the chest. We'll know more after the autopsy." Whitman gave a sharp nod, already beginning to piece together what could have happened. "Start canvassing. Someone saw something. A car, a person walking away, anything. Bodies don't just drop out of thin air." As the team worked under the dimming sky, Jacob Riley remained seated by his truck, too shaken to drive himself home. He gazed toward the hill's ridgeline, now teeming with investigators, and muttered quietly under his breath, "How could something like this happen here?" Little did anyone know on that fateful night, this discovery would unravel into a case that would involve betrayal, manipulation, and a meticulously sinister plan that no one could have foreseen. The victim. A man who believed in love. Michael Brooks was the kind of guy who believed in all the cliches about love. He believed in destiny, in holding open doors, in sending flowers just because it was Tuesday. Born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska, Michael wasn't the rich or flashy type. He was the boy-next-door kind of man. The one you'd rely on for help with a flat tire, or someone who'd lend you his jacket on a chilly evening, even if it meant freezing himself. At 26 years old, Michael was working as an accounting assistant for a local insurance firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and he was the kind of man who found pride in earning an honest paycheck. His colleagues liked him well enough, quiet, respectful, maybe a little boring, but always dependable. The type of guy who offered to buy everyone coffee on the morning Starbucks runs. But beneath his quiet demeanor was a deep yearning for connection, a desire to love and to be loved in return. Michael's friends often teased him for being too nice. They'd say things like, "Man, you've got to toughen up, people will take advantage of you." He'd just laugh it off. "It doesn't hurt to help people," he'd reply with a shrug, unknowingly foreshadowing the tragedy that would later define his life. It wasn't that Michael had never had girlfriends before, he had. But his relationships all seemed to end the same way. Michael giving too much and his partners taking until there was nothing left. "You need to find someone who appreciates you for you," his sister Megan would warn him during their family dinner talks. And for a while it seemed like he had listened. He stopped dating, focused on work, and saved up enough money to move into a small but cozy apartment near downtown Lincoln. But then came Cassandra Moore. She walked into Michael's life like a summer storm, sudden and fierce. Cassandra had this magnetic pull, the kind of beauty that turned heads and the confidence to back it up. She was 28, owned a small beauty salon on the outskirts of town, and carried herself with a charm that could disarm even the most skeptical soul. For Michael, she seemed perfect, out of his league but somehow still interested in him. They met at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue. Michael remembered that day vividly, the way her laugh carried across the yard, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her dreams of expanding her salon. She wasn't just beautiful, she was ambitious, passionate, a woman with plans for the future. And that was it. Michael was hooked. From the moment they exchanged numbers, Cassandra knew exactly how to reel him in. "You're just so different from other guys," she'd whisper late at night over the phone. "So genuine, I feel like I can trust you." Those words melted Michael every time because trust was the cornerstone of his identity. "What's the catch?" his best friend Andy joked when Michael first told him about Cassandra. "She's way too gorgeous for you, man." Andy didn't mean it cruelly, it was the kind of ribbing Michael was used to. But Michael just grinned and said, "Maybe I just got lucky." For Michael, Cassandra was everything he had ever wanted and more. He adored her, not just for her looks but for what he thought was her strength, her independence. She was the first person he had ever planned a future with. They'd only been dating for 3 months, but Michael was already daydreaming about proposing, maybe next spring, under the maple trees in Pioneers Park. But while Michael was falling head over heels, Cassandra had other plans. To Cassandra, Michael was a nice guy, sure. But nice guys didn't pay the bills. As their relationship progressed, she began to notice the cracks in the pillars of perfection Michael seemed to embody. His finances, for one, they weren't what she had hoped. Cassandra had assumed that his steady job meant disposable income. He wasn't flashy, sure, but she'd believed it was because he was smart with his money, maybe even frugal. The truth was far less exciting. Michael lived paycheck to paycheck, and while he had some savings, it wasn't nearly the cushion she was expecting. Still, she stayed. Maybe it was the steady stream of small gifts, flowers delivered to her salon, a bracelet she'd mentioned liking in passing, the occasional dinner at a nice steakhouse. Or maybe it was Michael's unwavering devotion, the way he looked at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Cassandra liked feeling desired, adored, even worshipped. But there came a point when liking something wasn't enough to sustain her interest. Cassandra wanted more. It didn't take long for her interest in Michael to sour into quiet disdain. Every time he spoke about building a life together or saving up for the future, she'd smile and nod, but inside, she'd roll her eyes. It was boring, predictable, and most importantly it wasn't lucrative. One evening as they were sitting on her balcony overlooking downtown Lincoln, Michael brought up the idea of taking a trip together. "I've been saving up," he said excitedly. "Maybe we could go to the Rockies, just a little getaway, just you and me?" Cassandra sipped her wine and gave him a half-hearted smile. "That sounds nice, babe." But her mind was elsewhere, already spinning with possibilities. She knew Michael had some money tucked away. She'd seen the way he fussed over his savings account balance on his phone, the pride he took in having a safety net. And that's when the idea began to form. Cassandra didn't just want a ticket out of the relationship. She wanted to make it worth her while. Michael had no idea what was coming. To him, Cassandra was the woman of his dreams, and their future together was bright. He saw her as someone he could build a life with, someone worth taking risks for. And that's exactly what he did. He trusted, he sacrificed, and he followed her down a path he didn't even realize was leading him to his death. A Fatal Descent, Cassandra and the Perfect Mask. Cassandra Moore had perfected the art of being two people at once. To the outside world, she was the charming owner of a small beauty salon, the kind of woman others would describe as driven, likable, and genuinely sweet. With her radiant smile and knack for putting people at ease, Cassandra drew clients who not only admired her skills with a curling iron, but also came to confide in her. Her salon buzzed with the sound of gossip and laughter punctuated by her soothing melodic voice. But beneath the polished exterior, Cassandra harbored a restlessness, a hunger she could never quite name. It wasn't enough to simply get by or to scrape together enough money to pay the bills for her lease and salon supplies every month. Deep down, Cassandra wanted more. A lot more. Stability and admiration were nice, but rich? That was the only status that mattered. Her life wasn't supposed to turn out this way. At least that's what Cassandra told herself on the nights she couldn't sleep. The daughter of a struggling mechanic and a waitress, she had grown up watching her parents fight over things as petty as grocery bills. To Cassandra, love had always been tangled up with stress, obligation, and disappointment, and she'd promised herself long ago that she would never make the same mistakes. Falling for nice guys who worked 9-to-5 jobs without ambition? That wasn't going to be her story. Cassandra wasn't always this cynical. In her early 20s, she'd tried to play by the rules of romance. She dated a few sweet, attentive men over the years, and for a while, things seemed fine. But what began as sweet relationships always curdled into something unbearable. The more effort the guys put into wooing her, flowers, texts, declarations of love, the quicker she realized how little she respected them. Each one ended with Cassandra bored out of her mind, picking imagined fights until they left for good. It was easier that way, less guilt. When she met Michael Brooks, though, Cassandra saw opportunity rather than romance. It started at a barbecue her friend had dragged her to, an awkward gathering in someone's backyard littered with cheap folding chairs and an out-of-tune guitar. Cassandra was checking her phone from the corner of the yard, tuning out a tipsy rendition of John Mayer's "Your Body is a Wonderland," when Michael approached her nervously. He introduced himself with a shy smile and a plate of burgers in hand. Michael was all politeness, stumbling over his words as he tried to explain how much he loved barbecues but never quite got the hang of flipping burgers without burning them. Cassandra laughed, not because the line was particularly funny, but because his awkwardness amused her. She recognized the kind of man Michael was immediately. Gentle, eager to please, easy to manipulate. "Lucky for you," she teased. "I'm not much of a chef either." Their conversation that evening was light and forgettable, but as Michael handed her his phone to swap numbers, Cassandra glanced down at his crisp button-down and conservative leather watch. He looked like the type with a steady paycheck. Even if he wasn't rich, not yet anyway, he was sweet enough to do anything she asked. That, Cassandra decided, could be far more valuable. At first, Cassandra genuinely enjoyed Michael's attention. The flirty texts, late-night FaceTime calls, and impromptu dinner dates were fun, like a game of cat and mouse where she always held the upper hand. She liked hearing him ramble about work or make awkward jokes as he walked her to her car. Michael was the kind of guy who doted on a woman, the kind who called to ask, "Did you get home safe?" Even when her drive was a short 5 blocks away. But the more time she spent with him, the more Cassandra started to see the cracks in her fantasy. Michael wasn't wealthy, not even close. While he tried to hide it, she noticed how he carefully kept dates within his budget. Sometimes it was the small, telling things, like the way his card hesitated slightly when he swiped to pay for dinner, or how he'd suggest coffee instead of cocktails. She also noticed the desperation in his compliments, how he'd light up with her approval. "You're so incredible," he would whisper to her one night as they walked out of a restaurant. "I feel so lucky just sitting next to you." At first, it was flattering. Over time, it became exhausting. If there was one thing Cassandra couldn't stand, it was a man who made himself too easy to love. But unlike her past relationships, where Cassandra would have grown bored and ghosted the guy, she felt like there was more to be gained from Michael. The shift in her motives was subtle. Cassandra stopped answering Michael's texts with the same bubbly enthusiasm. Instead, her responses became slow and calculated. She started hinting at how hard it was to run a small business, how the bills were piling up, or how she desperately longed for a vacation but couldn't afford one. The messages were always wrapped in charm, ending with some variation of, "But you don't need to worry about me, sweetie, I'm figuring it out, I always do." Michael, always eager to swoop in, began offering help. "I could spot you if you needed." Or, Maybe I could surprise you with something nice, you deserve it." And each time, Cassandra let him take one step closer to the trap she was setting. Her plan took form on a chilly Thursday night while she was scrolling through Michael's social media photos. Most of his pictures were uneventful, shots in khakis and ties alongside co-workers or group selfies at bowling alleys. But one post caught her eye. It was a grainy snapshot of an accounting award ceremony captioned, "Saved up 6 months for this suit, totally worth it." That's when she realized the truth. Michael was a saver. If he wasn't rich now, that didn't mean he didn't have money stashed away somewhere. His meek nature and quiet humility hinted at someone who meticulously prepared for rainy days. Cassandra smirked, spinning her wine glass in small, lazy circles as a plan began to swirl in her mind. What she needed wasn't another relationship bound to fizzle out in disappointment. What she needed was a payout, and Michael was the perfect man to fund her next chapter. From that night forward, she shifted into full manipulation mode. Cassandra started planting seeds of how much she wanted to get out of town, to go somewhere special with him. "We should do something memorable," she said one evening on his balcony. "Just the two of us, somewhere quiet, like the mountains." She let the idea sit in his head, watering it with compliments like, "You're the only person I'd take a trip like that with." When Michael told her he had savings and that he'd love to treat her, Cassandra smiled slyly. "Let's think about it," she said sweetly. Her mind, however, was already racing. She didn't want mountains or a peaceful getaway. She wanted to empty Michael's account and leave without looking back. But where most people would hesitate, torn between moral lines, Cassandra felt no such conflict. Her entire life was a balancing act between getting what she wanted and hiding who she was. And with Michael completely blind to her real intentions, she knew she was perfectly poised to pull off what would become the darkest chapter of both their lives. The third player, the mysterious man. Every heist, every con, and every cunning plan always has the wild card, the person who shifts the balance between manipulation and execution. For Cassandra Moore, that person was Jimmy Brown. If Cassandra was the mastermind, Jimmy was the undercurrent of chaos she needed to carry out her plans. Together, they made for a volatile, morally bankrupt partnership. Jimmy Brown, 32 years old, was far from the clean-cut boys next door that populated small-town Nebraska. From the moment he walked into a room, his presence was unmistakable, a coiled energy like a predator waiting to spring. He wasn't classically handsome, but there was something about him. The sharp jawline, the intense eyes, and the faint hint of danger that made you notice. Jimmy carried himself in a way that suggested he had seen and done things most people avoided imagining. And he had. Born and raised in a neighboring state, Jimmy had a reputation that trailed him like a dark shadow. He was the middle child in a family of 5, but trouble always seemed to follow him. Fights in high school over disrespect, a couple of arrests in his early 20s for petty thefts, and most notably, a conviction for aggravated assault that landed him 3 years in prison. Since his release, his life had been a collage of odd jobs, failed relationships, and quick schemes to make cash, none of which lasted long. What he lacked in stability, though, he made up for with street smarts. Jimmy was the kind of guy who knew how to navigate gray areas where rules didn't apply. For someone like Cassandra, he was the perfect accomplice. Years before their encounter, Cassandra and Jimmy had no notable connection. They lived in separate states, ran in different circles, and carried vastly different facades of normalcy. Cassandra pretended to be the ambitious, hard-working business owner, while Jimmy moved under the surface like a shark, feeding off whatever opportunities swam his way. They shouldn't have crossed paths, but fate, or perhaps a cruel twist of fortune, brought them together through a mutual friend, one of Cassandra's less reputable clients at her beauty salon, someone who just so happened to know Jimmy from business on the side. Cassandra first met Jimmy at a poker night she'd reluctantly attended. Initially, she wasn't impressed. He was rough, loud, and his jokes carried an edge that made the room either laugh nervously or fall silent. But as hours passed, she began to notice something else: Jimmy's tactical nature. Beneath the bravado and poor social graces, it was clear that Jimmy knew how to play people. He could read faces, hone in on weaknesses. By the end of the night, she wasn't annoyed, she was intrigued. Well, Jimmy had said with a crooked grin as he shuffled cards toward her. "I don't see ladies like you at games like these. What's your game, Cassandra? What are you after?" Cassandra smirked as she took her seat. "Winning," she replied simply, meeting his intensity with her own calculated charm. Jimmy chuckled, the sound low and guttural. "You're dangerous, aren't you?" It wasn't a question, it was more like an observation. and it wasn't entirely wrong. By the night's end, she had his number. She didn't use it right away. At that time, Jimmy was just another name in her mental Rolodex, a potential tool for future plans. It wasn't until Michael Brooks entered her life with his far too dependable kindness and promising bank account that Cassandra began to see value in rekindling her acquaintance with Jimmy. When she finally called Jimmy, it wasn't a request for help, it was an offer. "I've got a golden opportunity," Cassandra said in a measured tone as she leaned against her kitchen counter, tracing patterns on the granite with her perfectly painted nails. She made sure to sound calm, confident, and just cryptic enough to spark his interest. "Opportunity, huh?" Jimmy replied, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Opportunities don't normally sound this shady. What are you thinking, sweetheart?" Cassandra bit her lip to suppress a smirk. Jimmy was predictable in that way, skeptical but always curious. "I've got someone who's too infatuated with me for his own good. Someone I think we can squeeze," she said casually, letting her words hang. "You get a cut if it goes well." Jimmy laughed, the sound warm but edged with menace. "You're full of secrets, ain't you? Who's this guy?" "A sweet guy named Michael," Cassandra sighed. "The problem is sweet doesn't pay, but let's just say he's sitting on a little nest egg. And after he's been crying over me for months when I leave, he won't even notice it's gone." Jimmy was silent for a moment, weighing her words. He wasn't a stranger to schemes, but this one had its peculiarities. Running a con with someone like Cassandra, a woman as polished as she was cold, felt like walking a tightrope. "This isn't gonna be one of those oops, someone ends up in a ditch kind of things, is it?" His question was half joking, but Cassandra's response told him all he needed to know. "That depends," she said, her voice cool and steady. "Whether they let go, or whether they make me tighten the knot." Jimmy understood what she meant. There were things he didn't like doing, things he'd promised himself he wouldn't return to after prison, but money had been tight and Cassandra dangled just enough of it in front of him to make him bite. Plus, Cassandra herself intrigued him, like a puzzle he couldn't fully solve. So, he was in. Jimmy's role in the plan was to do the dirty work. Cassandra was too clever to leave fingerprints, too proud to stoop to the level of physical confrontation. That was where Jimmy came in. A man who didn't flinch at the idea of dirt under his nails or blood on his boots. Cassandra fed him the details in small increments, never giving too much at once. She framed her plan like a game of chess, with Michael as the sacrificial pawn. "We'll make it look like an accident," she instructed during one of their hushed meetings. They were seated in the corner booth of an all-night diner, the fluorescent lighting casting shadows over Jimmy's sharp features. "I'll lure him out, give him something to relax. You'll make sure he doesn't come back." Jimmy sipped his black coffee, his jaw tightening as he digested the words. "So, just to be clear," he said slowly, "this isn't about just taking the money and running. This is final." Cassandra tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "It's the cleanest way. If he's alive, he talks." Jimmy didn't argue. She wasn't wrong, but the moral cost of the plan wasn't something he was ready to unpack. For Jimmy, this was about survival. For Cassandra, it was about domination. With his part of the plan clear, Jimmy vanished into the background until the day of the execution. On July 15th, under Cassandra's direction, he drove out to a secluded area near Nebraska Hill and lay in wait. His job wasn't glamorous, but Cassandra made him feel like a power player, a key piece in her game. And that, more than the promise of money, is what kept him in place, even as the guilt started to creep in. When the moment finally came, Jimmy followed Cassandra's lead. He watched her hand Michael the fateful drink, listened as her voice dripped with sweetness turned venom. And when Michael grew weak and stumbled, it was Jimmy who stepped forward, his hands steady but his pulse racing, to drag the stumbling man closer to the edge. "It's just business, buddy," Jimmy muttered under his breath as he did the unthinkable. But somewhere deep down, even Jimmy knew, they had gone way too far. Jimmy Brown was a wild card, a loose end Cassandra thought she could control. But in a plan as precarious and twisted as theirs, no one stays loyal forever. The fateful day, isolating Michael. July 15th, was a typical summer evening in Lincoln, Nebraska. The buzzing of cicadas filled the humid air as the sun began its slow descent, painting the streets in hues of orange and gold. To Michael Brooks, the day felt promising, special even. Cassandra had texted him early that morning asking him to meet her for dinner that evening. "I want to talk," the message had read, followed by a coy smile emoji. Michael's heart fluttered as he reread the text throughout the day, allowing himself to hope that maybe tonight would be the night she opened up about their future. Michael didn't overthink what "I want to talk" meant. In his mind, Cassandra wanted to share something meaningful with him, perhaps a new milestone in their relationship, a confirmation of the connection he felt growing stronger every time they were together. He dressed in his best button-down shirt, one she had complimented on a date weeks earlier, and polished his leather loafers till they gleamed. Meanwhile, Cassandra was equally meticulous in her preparation, but for entirely different reasons. The night wasn't about romance or meaningful conversations, it was about luring Michael exactly where she needed him, into her carefully laid trap. Dressed in a simple yet flattering sundress, Cassandra practiced her smile in the mirror, one that radiated warmth and sincerity. The kind of smile Michael would interpret as love, but one that concealed the icy precision of her true intention. The restaurant Cassandra chose wasn't particularly fancy, but it was intimate. A small Italian bistro several miles outside the city, far enough from the downtown buzz to ensure privacy. She picked a table on the patio, secluded by clusters of flowering vines, and waited for Michael to arrive. Michael showed up 5 minutes early, of course. That was the kind of man he was. Punctual, dependable, always eager to please. He spotted Cassandra sitting at the table, her golden curls catching the light of the setting sun, and his face lit up with awe. "You look stunning," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration as he took his seat across from her. Cassandra reached over and placed her hand lightly on his, the gesture deliberate. "And you're as sweet as ever, Michael," she replied, her words silky smooth. Her voice carried the perfect balance of affection and allure, setting the stage for what was to follow. Over plates of linguine and garlic bread, Cassandra wove her narrative with careful precision. She laughed at Michael's stories, complimented his thoughtfulness, even leaned in closer as if hanging onto his every word. But toward the end of the meal, her tone shifted, just enough to plant the seed of her plan. "You know," she began softly, twirling her glass of wine in one hand, "I've been thinking about us a lot lately, about how much I appreciate everything you've done for me." Michael's attention locked onto her, his heart swelling at her words. "I'd do anything for you, Cassandra," he said earnestly. "You mean the world to me." She smiled, bittersweet on the surface but calculated underneath. "That's part of the problem. I feel like you've given me so much, but I haven't been able to give you the same effort back." She looked down at her plate, feigning vulnerability. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not enough for you, Michael." His brow furrowed, panic creeping into his expression. "What? No, Cassandra, don't say that. You're more than enough. I didn't mean to make you feel that way." Cassandra shook her head softly. "I know, sweetheart. I know you mean well." She paused for effect before reaching the crescendo of her manipulation. "That's why I was thinking, we need a night that's just about us. No distractions, no noise, just you and me someplace quiet. I think it could help me feel closer to you." Michael blinked, confused at first but quickly nodding, eager to reassure her. "Of course. Yeah, we could plan a night like that, whatever you need." "Not plan," she corrected him, her lips curling into a small, almost shy smile. "Tonight, after dinner, there's this spot I've heard about, Nebraska Hill. People say it's beautiful at sunset with hardly anyone around. I thought maybe you'd want to take me there. We could, I don't know, just talk, lay everything out." "Nebraska Hill?" Michael echoed, a hint of hesitation in his voice. He'd heard of the place, mostly used for hiking and hunting. It wasn't exactly a place couples went, but if Cassandra wanted it, he'd agree without a second thought. "Sure," he said after a moment. "If it's what you want, I'm in." Cassandra leaned back in her chair, satisfied. The trap was set. After paying the bill, Michael insisted on covering it. They climbed into his modest blue sedan and began the 20-minute drive toward Nebraska Hill. The atmosphere in the car was relaxed. Michael made small talk about the stars coming out and the breeze cooling off the summer heat. But Cassandra stayed quiet, gazing out the window as if lost in thought. In reality, she was mentally calculating every step of what was about to unfold. She'd instructed Jimmy Brown to wait near the base of Nebraska Hill, hidden behind a thick patch of trees with his truck parked out of sight. Jimmy's role was simple: get rid of Michael. How he did it wasn't her concern. All Cassandra cared about was that by the end of the night, Michael's savings and her freedom would be hers. When they arrived, Nebraska Hill was bathed in a hazy orange glow as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the rocky terrain. Cassandra climbed out of the car first, inhaling deeply as if savoring the fresh air. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, motioning for Michael to follow her. "Yeah," Michael agreed, his eyes flicking nervously toward the overgrown trail ahead. "Kind of quiet, though." "That's the point," Cassandra said with a soft laugh. She slipped her hand into his and led him down the path. Further into the wooded area, the trail grew narrower, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. Michael began to feel uneasy, but Cassandra pressed forward, her confidence unwavering. She stopped abruptly near a flat clearing overlooking the steep hills below and turned to face him. "This is it," she whispered, her expression shifting from playful to serious. Michael smiled hesitantly. "It's nice, but what did you want to talk about?" Cassandra reached into her bag and pulled out a small can of soda she'd brought with her. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "You look nervous. Take a sip. It'll help you relax." Michael hesitated for a brief moment but trusted her enough to take the can. As he tipped it back for a drink, the shadow of Jimmy Brown emerged in the distance, his presence unnoticed by Michael but well within Cassandra's line of sight. She nodded subtly in his direction, the signal clear. Michael wiped his mouth, a slight frown forming. "This tastes weird," he said, his voice barely audible as his legs wobbled beneath him. And just like that, Cassandra's plan began to unfold. The trap on Nebraska Hill. The air on Nebraska Hill as evening descended carried a strange stillness. The last hues of daylight clung to the horizon, painting the endless sky in muted amber tones. Below, the dry grasses shivered in a faint breeze, their whispers the only sound breaking the eerie silence. For most, this was the kind of night that encouraged contemplation, a chance to escape from the world. But for Michael Brooks, it would be the night his world would shatter. Cassandra Moore stood a few steps ahead of Michael on the narrow dirt trail, her sundress swaying lightly in the breeze. Something almost ethereal about her seemed to blend into the surroundings, the golden threads of her hair, the soft curve of her smile as she looked back at him. But it wasn't warmth in her eyes. It wasn't concern or love in that fleeting look. It was cold, calculated precision. "Come on," she said softly, reaching out her hand as if beckoning him closer, not just physically but emotionally. "We're almost there." Michael followed like an obedient shadow, the trust in his heart unwavering despite the growing unease in his gut. "This is a strange spot for a romantic night," he teased, his voice light but edged with nervousness. "No candles, no wine, feels more like a hiking trip." Cassandra turned, the corners of her lips curling in a way that was both playful and deceiving. "Sometimes you have to get away from it all, right, Michael? You said yourself, you'd go anywhere for me." Her words were artfully chosen. Her tone dipped in just enough sweetness to make Michael's doubts falter. This was her gift, turning his concerns into fleeting thoughts, distractions as harmless as summer clouds. "You're right," he said quickly, trying to dismiss the slight chill running down his spine. "Anywhere for you." They reached a clearing moments later. The view was breathtaking, almost dreamlike. The hill plunged into a steep, jagged drop, and beyond it, the horizon stretched endlessly into fields of golden grass and silhouetted trees. Cassandra stopped near the edge, letting her fingers trail against an outcrop of worn stone as though testing its steadiness. "This is perfect," she whispered, her voice barely audible now, like the wind itself had carried away most of her words. Michael paused a few feet back, catching his breath. His hands on his hips, he arched an eyebrow toward her. "And now?" he asked with a small chuckle. "What happens? Are we supposed to talk about something?" His attempt at lightheartedness barely concealed his confusion. Cassandra's gaze didn't meet his, not right away. Instead, she looked out over the edge, her eyes scanning the hills below with a sharpness she kept hidden beneath her practiced composure. What she was really looking at, of course, was the hidden layer of the plan, the one waiting quietly, just out of sight. Jimmy Brown, crouched down and ready, his wiry frame pressed against the shadowed ground beneath a cluster of sagebrush not far from their position. It had all been orchestrated perfectly. Jimmy was exactly where he needed to be. He'd parked his truck out of sight 2 hours earlier, made his way up through the tree line and waited for Cassandra's arrival. His patience wore thin quickly, as it always did, but Cassandra knew how to handle him. Not a second earlier, not a second after, she'd told him firmly when outlining the plan a few days before. "Just stay there until you see me nod. That's your signal." He wanted his paycheck, and he wanted it fast, but he liked Cassandra just enough, or feared what she might do if he botched this job enough, that he followed her instructions meticulously. She was the puppeteer here, and Jimmy knew it. Cassandra turned back to Michael, her hand slipping into the small leather purse she'd carefully packed in advance. "I brought this," she said softly, pulling out the can of soda she had prepared for him. "I thought it might be nice to share something." He frowned, a little surprised. "A soda?" he asked, the confusion evident on his face. "Kind of an unusual choice for a date night." Her laugh came easily, light and effortless. "Not everything has to be champagne, Michael," she said, holding it out toward him. Besides, I know how you love simple things. Have some. You always look like you could use something to relax." Michael hesitated for a brief moment, not long enough to notice the shadow stirring behind the distant brush, but long enough that Cassandra thought she might need to step in. Then, with his typical Michael sincerity, he took the can from her hands, smiling faintly. "You always think ahead," he murmured, as he cracked it open. Instinctively he tipped his head back and took a swig. It was sharp and bitter on his tongue, far from the sweetness he expected. He grimaced, shaking his head slightly. "That's different. What is this, some kind of health drink?" But before Cassandra could respond, he stumbled. At first it wasn't obvious, just a minor falter as Michael took a step back, his legs wobbling slightly as though the hill's uneven surface had tripped him. He reached up to rub at his forehead, his expression one of sudden confusion. "I think something's not right," he whispered. His words slurred slightly, as though they had been stretched and pulled between two worlds. Cassandra moved closer, her hand brushing his arm. Not in support, though. It was subtle, but she guided his movement toward the edge of the clearing, inch by fumbling inch. "Hey, sit down," she said softly, feigning concern. "You probably just need air." Jimmy crept closer now, hearing every word above the shallow crunch of his boots against the dry soil. From where he crouched, Michael hadn't even noticed him yet. The man's movements were too unsteady, his focus too blurred. Cassandra!" Michael tried again, his voice shaky. "What's happening? I don't—" "Shh!" Cassandra interrupted, her voice silky with practiced charm. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here. I'll take care of you." But as he finally wavered toward the dirt, blinking hard against the sudden weight pressing down on his body, Cassandra turned ever so slightly toward the figures in the distance. One brief, calculated tilt of her chin. The signal was clear. Jimmy stood, his expression resolute but uneasy. He moved quickly now, his shoulders hunched, his hands steady despite the knots in his gut. He muttered something under his breath, something unintelligible as he closed the gap between himself and Michael in seconds. Cassandra stepped back, letting him take control of the situation. "Sorry, bud," Jimmy murmured as he grabbed Michael under his arms, hoisting him up clumsily. The weight of Michael's stumbling body pressed awkwardly against him, but Jimmy was strong, stronger than you'd guess for his wiry build. "Nothing personal." Cassandra's face betrayed nothing as she watched. Her calmness was eerie, as though none of it, the betrayal, the panic in Michael's eyes, the inevitability of what was about to happen, registered as real to her. It was Jimmy who dragged Michael the last few feet toward the edge, while Michael's faint cries echoed around them, and it was Jimmy who leaned close to mutter the final words into Michael's ear. "It's just business." Then silence. Cassandra stepped closer to the edge moments later, peering down into the abyss where Michael's limp body now lay motionless, surrounded by jagged rocks and dust. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension melt off her shoulders. "Clean job," she muttered, her voice flat as she turned back to Jimmy. "Now let's get the hell out of here." Jimmy didn't respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he followed her back toward the trail, his conscience stirring uncomfortably despite himself. But for now, Cassandra's plan was complete. Her trap had sprung. The staged crime. As the final crackling echoes faded into the quiet stillness of Nebraska Hill, Cassandra Moore wiped her hands slowly against the edge of her sundress, as though physically distancing herself from the deed. She didn't glance back down the ridge, there was no need to. The plan that had been swirling inside her head for weeks was now unfolding exactly how she'd envisioned. Every calculated move had led to this moment. But while Cassandra's exterior radiated an eerie calmness, marking her as the mastermind behind this tragedy, the layers of deception leading to the staged crime ran deeper than the jagged cliffs below. Jimmy Brown, standing a few feet away, his breath ragged, hands still faintly shaking from the weight of Michael Brooks's lifeless body, shifted on his heels uncomfortably. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the cool summer breeze should have eased it. His wiry frame cast a long, distorted shadow on the rocky ground, a grim reminder of his part in the gruesome job. "You okay there?" Cassandra's cool voice sliced through the tense silence like a blade. She didn't sound concerned, just curious, almost detached, as though they'd wrapped up a simple chore and she was evaluating his efficiency. Jimmy shot her a look, his jaw tightening. "Hard to be okay when you just—" He stopped himself, running a hand down the back of his neck. "Look, this doesn't feel right, all right? You didn't tell me it was going to feel like this." Cassandra cocked her head slightly, her blue eyes narrowing like a hawk observing prey. "Feel like what, Jimmy?" she asked, her tone drenched with condescension. She was already shifting gears, moving to the next phase of her plan while he was still standing there like a statue. "Like there's no coming back from this," he muttered. She smirked faintly, pulling a pack of gum from her purse as though this was her idea of post-crime ritual. "There never was," she said simply, popping a piece of peppermint into her mouth. "But we're already too far in, and so far, you've done exactly what you're good at. Don't start growing a conscience now." Jimmy let the words hang in the air, his fists clenching unconsciously at her dismissiveness, but he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Crossing the moral line wasn't a gradual curve, it was a single step into utter darkness. And he'd stepped willingly. Cassandra had been meticulous in her approach to make Michael's death appear as an accident. There was no room for error. She'd spent hours researching, thinking of every detail that could raise suspicion. Nebraska Hill wasn't just chosen for its relative seclusion and breathtaking, seemingly peaceful scenery, it was perfect because of its reputation. Rugged trails frequented by hikers and campers. Nature's unpredictability would lend the perfect alibi. "Climbing accidents happen all the time," Cassandra had told Jimmy a week before as they huddled over cheap diner coffee while she laid out her strategy. "He trips, he falls, maybe he slips on loose rock." She exaggerated a pitying look, but it was laced with venomous amusement. Such a tragic cliché story. Then her eyes sharpened as she tapped her perfectly manicured nail against the table. "But tragic works. Tragic keeps people from looking further." Jimmy didn't respond at the time, just nodded in distant agreement. It was easier to accept Cassandra's chilling confidence about the plan than to think too hard about his role in it. Once Michael's body disappeared over the edge of the cliff and down into the jagged rocks, Cassandra kicked into her next mode, control. The timeline was now her primary concern. For the plan to stick, she needed precision from every angle, how they moved, what they left behind, what they told authorities. Any loose ends could unravel into questions that might expose the truth. "Get the soda can!" she barked at Jimmy, nodding toward the crushed aluminum lying a few feet away near the trail where Michael had staggered. "Wipe it! Clean! No prints, no DNA!" Jimmy hesitated. "Won't it look more natural if we leave it? If it stays there it fits like he might have brought it himself." Cassandra's gaze was ice cold. "You've been cleaning up after your messes longer than I've been alive, Jimmy," she said sharply. "Don't start questioning the one person making sure this doesn't fall apart." Reluctantly, he did as she said. The soda can, laced with whatever substance Cassandra had spiked it with earlier, was a damning piece of evidence if left unchecked. Wiping it clean and tossing it into a black trash bag she'd brought along was a calculated step Cassandra had made sure to add to their plan. There were other loose ends to address next. They had planned for this moment meticulously, but the scene on Nebraska Hill needed to look unplanned, accidental, tragic, but never suspicious. Cassandra crouched on the dirt trail, dirt staining her knees as she dragged her finger lazily over a patch of dust and grass disturbed by Michael's earlier movements. With painstaking care, she scraped a heel across the soil, marking what could pass for a clumsy skid leading toward the ledge. She stepped back, surveying the disturbed earth with a critical eye. "That's good enough," she said aloud as much to herself as to Jimmy. "When the cops come poking around, they'll see exactly what they expect to see." Her voice softened mockingly, like a bad TV detective. "Oh, he must have been standing too close. One wrong step. Such a tragic accident." Jimmy glanced over the scuffed dirt and furrowed his brow. The perfection of it unsettled him even more. "You've done this before?" he asked, an edge to his voice. Cassandra gave him a dry laugh and slapped the dust off her hands. "No," she replied nonchalantly, "but it's not that hard to figure out. People are predictable, Jimmy. They believe the story you show them, especially if the story is something they've seen 100 times before." As the trail descended into darkness, Cassandra and Jimmy fled the scene. They left no tire tracks, no fingerprints, no obvious giveaways. Michael's body was exactly where they wanted it to be, and the evidence left behind painted a single, clear narrative. A man too caught up in the serenity of the place to notice how dangerously close he had ventured to the precipice. Cassandra directed Jimmy to a remote gas station 20 miles away. It was there that she insisted they burn the black trash bag containing the soda can, wrappers, and any other potential pieces of evidence. Jimmy smoothed his hands nervously over the wheel of his truck as Cassandra stood outside with a lighter, the contents going up in flames. "The cops won't have anything to find," she said smoothly as the flames swallowed the trash. "By the time someone stumbles on him out there, it'll all add up exactly how we planned." Jimmy didn't respond. The sound of the trash crackling in the barrel was already too loud, too much of a scream in his mind. But what Cassandra hadn't accounted for, what neither of them accounted for, was that even the most carefully staged crime was vulnerable to human error. Pieces of the story didn't sit right. A suspicious coroner, a hiker's unexpected testimony, and one tiny misstep, something neither of them had noticed in their rush. The faint outline of Cassandra's fingerprint, smudged but still visible on the edge of the soda can, even after Jimmy wiped it. No matter how perfect the stage, the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. The investigation, the first clue. The morning of July 17th was like any other on Nebraska Hill, quiet, unassuming, bathed in the golden glow of the rising sun. The kind of morning that felt untouched by tragedy. But that serene facade broke when a pair of hikers ventured onto the rarely used trail leading to the rocky cliffs. They weren't expecting anything more than snapping a few sunrise pictures and enjoying their coffee thermos in peace. But instead, what they found would set off a chain of events that would unravel everything Cassandra Moore had so meticulously planned. It started with a smell. "Do you smell that?" The taller of the two hikers scrunched his nose and turned towards the wind. It smells like rotten meat or something?" The other hiker stiffened. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "That ain't normal. Maybe an animal died around here?" The two crept toward the brush, following the nauseating scent until they stumbled upon something that froze them in place. Wedged awkwardly among the jagged rocks at the foot of a steep cliff was a body, face down, arms and legs twisted in unnatural angles. Even from their vantage point above, it was clear. This wasn't a sleeping camper or an unfortunate hunter. This was a corpse. "Oh my God," one of the hikers whispered, pulling out his cell phone with trembling hands. "Call the cops. Call right now." The local sheriff's department arrived within the hour, their vehicles skidding to a stop in a cloud of dirt and gravel. Sheriff Dan Wilson, a burly man with graying temples and permanently furrowed brows, was the first to step onto the scene. Pulling his aviators down over his eyes, he surveyed the area with a practiced calm. This wasn't the first time someone had fallen or gone missing in these hills. Nature had a way of swallowing people foolish enough to underestimate it. But something about this scene gnawed at him. A forensic team worked quickly, descending the rocky path to examine the body. Michael's twisted form was quickly pulled from its resting place. His wallet was missing, but his back pocket still contained a partially crumpled receipt from an Italian bistro. That small piece of paper would later prove to be the first clue that connected him to Cassandra Moore. As the coroner rolled Michael over, the bruises around his chest and shoulders became more evident, patterns inconsistent with a simple fall. "This wasn't an accident," whispered the lead forensic technician crouching beside Michael's body. Sheriff Wilson raised an eyebrow, walking up to join her. "You're sure?" The forensics expert nodded grimly. "The bruises are clustered, hand marks roughly around his chest. Look, someone grabbed him hard enough to leave this." Wilson exhaled sharply, gazing upward at the cliffs. At first glance it was easy to write off. The rocks were treacherous, the area isolated, an unlucky step and down he'd go. But those bruises told a different story, one that meant they were dealing with something a hell of a lot darker. "And that's not all," the technician added. "I haven't confirmed yet, but his pupils suggest poisoning." Wilson squinted toward the horizon, his gut turning. Hikers didn't just fall off cliffs accidentally with bruises shaped like human hands and potential toxins in their system. There was foul play here, no doubt about it. The next move was protocol: investigate the scene thoroughly. Evidence markers dotted the trail like breadcrumbs. Scratch marks in the dry dirt caught Wilson's attention. Strange skid patterns leading toward the ledge. He crouched down, running a gloved hand over the grooves. They were too deliberate, as though someone had kicked or dragged their feet intentionally. "Take photos of this," he barked to the forensic team. Thoughts churned in his mind, pieces of a puzzle still missing their big picture. "Sheriff," one of the deputies called from farther up the trail, holding up a faintly crumpled aluminum can. "Found this about 50 yards back, looks like soda or something." Wilson took the can, inspecting it closely. "Get this to the lab," he said. "Let's see if it's got anything on it. Prints, residue, anything." By the afternoon, Nebraska Hill was a swirling hive of law enforcement activity. News traveled fast in small towns like Lincoln. Whispers started in diners, spilled across checkout lines, and eventually made their way to Michael Brooks's family. His sister, Megan, was the first to receive the devastating phone call. "What do you mean he's gone?" she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. No, that doesn't make sense. He was happy. He wouldn't have climbed that hill alone, he wouldn't. Within hours of Megan reporting Michael as missing 2 days earlier, the police shifted focus. With a known identity attached to the body, interviews began. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, all were asked one question: who was Michael last seen with? And over the answer was the same: Cassandra Moore. Meanwhile, Cassandra woke up that day oblivious to how her carefully spun web would soon begin to collapse. She drank her morning coffee on her balcony, scrolling through her phone as though all of Lincoln hadn't just erupted with news of the mysterious body. Jimmy, however, wasn't faring as well. He'd been glued to his TV, frantically flipping between local stations. Every breaking news clip about Nebraska Hill seemed to tighten the chains around him. "They found him," Jimmy muttered under his breath, staring blankly at the screen. "Jesus Christ, they actually found him!" Cassandra's phone buzzed just after noon. It wasn't Jimmy. It was law enforcement. "Miss Moore, this is Sheriff Wilson with the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department. Can you come down to the station for a few questions about Michael Brooks?" Her stomach tightened. "Michael? What's this about?" she asked, her voice feigning shock and immediate concern. "We'd rather discuss it in person." Cassandra hung up and tossed her phone onto the counter, her fingers gripping the marble edge tightly for composure. She told herself to stay calm. Police called people in all the time. They didn't have anything on her, they couldn't. She'd planned everything. The investigation began to close in quickly. The soda can was pivotal. It came back from the lab with a faint fingerprint, smudged but recoverable: Cassandra Moore's. Toxicology reports confirmed the soda had residual traces of an unidentified sedative, just enough to impair someone severely. And then came the receipt. The bistro receipt found in Michael's pocket was dated July 15th, the last day anyone had seen him alive. Security footage from the Italian restaurant painted a damning picture: Michael and Cassandra sitting on the patio laughing over dinner. Nothing unusual except for the timestamp, far too close to his time of death to be dismissed. Sheriff Wilson ran a hand over his face as his team presented the reports that stacked up against Cassandra Moore. "All right," he muttered, setting them down on his desk. "She's got 24 hours before we bring her in. Let's find out just how cold our Miss Moore really is." But deep down he knew. The first clue was never the end of it. Every breadcrumb led to darker truths waiting just beneath the surface. The statements and contradictions. Cassandra Moore sat in the sterile, cold interrogation room of the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department, her hands folded neatly on the gray metal table in front of her. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights hanging overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows on the walls. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing an understated blouse and dark jeans, an outfit meant to scream normal girl caught up in a terrible tragedy. Her makeup was natural, just enough to suggest someone who was trying to pull herself together despite the shock of what had happened. Sheriff Dan Wilson stepped into the room, his clipboard tucked under one arm, and eyed Cassandra with the measured scrutiny of someone who had seen too many criminals play innocent. He closed the door behind him with a deliberate click and took a seat across from her, placing the folder on the table between them. "Miss Moore," Wilson began, his voice calm but firm, "thank you for coming down today." Cassandra gave him a polite, slightly strained smile. "Of course, Sheriff. Is this about Michael?" She tilted her head just enough to let her blonde curls shift to one side. "I heard the news. It's horrible. I can't even believe something like this happened." Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "It is horrible," he said, his tone neutral. "Michael Brooks was found 2 days ago at the base of Nebraska Hill." Cassandra nodded solemnly, her expression perfectly calibrated to convey just the right amount of sadness without tipping into melodrama. "I've been trying to process it," she said softly, glancing down as if bracing herself for the weight of grief. "He didn't deserve something like this." Wilson didn't respond right away. Instead, he opened the manila folder and slid out a photograph, placing it face up on the table. It was a still image from the Italian bistro security camera showing Cassandra and Michael seated outside, enjoying what looked like a quiet dinner. "This was from the evening of July 15th, Wilson said, tapping the picture with his finger. "You and Michael were together that night, correct?" Cassandra's breath hitched slightly, just enough to seem real but controlled. "Yes," she admitted. "We'd gone out to dinner. Michael wanted to talk and, well..." Her voice trailed off as she swallowed hard. "That was the last time I saw him." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "The last time you saw him?" "Yes," she insisted, her voice soft but steady. "We had dinner and then..." Then he told me he wanted to go for a walk alone, clear his head. I even told him it might not be safe going to Nebraska Hill so late, but he said he'd be fine. She looked up at Wilson with pleading eyes. I feel awful now, like I should have pushed harder to stop him. For a moment the room was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead light. Sheriff Wilson let Cassandra's words hang in the air, watching her carefully. Given her poise, the way she leaned just slightly forward to appear earnest, it would have been easy for someone less experienced to believe her. But Wilson didn't move. "You didn't drive him there?" he asked finally, his voice deceptively light. "No," Cassandra replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Like I said, he wanted to be alone. I offered, but he insisted." "Didn't it seem unusual for him to want to go out there by himself at night?" Wilson pressed. "Well, that's how Michael was," she stammered, faltering just enough to create a hint of vulnerability. "He was thoughtful, introspective. Sometimes he just needed space to think." Wilson nodded slowly, leaning forward now. "What about the drink?" Cassandra blinked. "The drink?" "Yeah," Wilson said casually, flipping a page in the folder. "The soda can. Lab reports showed it had been spiked with a sedative. Did Michael have anything to drink while you were at the restaurant?" Her hands tightened slightly in her lap, but she kept her face neutral. No, not that I noticed. He had water with dinner." Wilson paused, watching her closely. He didn't press the question further, not yet. Instead he shifted gears. Meanwhile, in another room down the hall, Jimmy Brown was seated in a similar interrogation room, though he handled things much differently. While Cassandra projected control veiled under layers of innocence, Jimmy radiated unease. His shoulders were hunched, his legs restless as they bounced under the table, and his eyes darted toward the mirrored glass on the wall, as if he could feel someone watching. Detective Carol Whitman sat across from him, her arms crossed over her chest, her no-nonsense demeanor a sharp contrast to Wilson's calm, probing style. "All right, Jimmy," she said, her voice clipped. "Let's make this easy. Start talking." Jimmy let out a nervous laugh, scratching the back of his head. "Look, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know anything about what happened to that guy." "Michael Brooks," Whitman said firmly, leaning in. "That guy is Michael Brooks. And unless you want to keep digging yourself into a deeper hole, you're going to start explaining why your name keeps coming up." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. I barely knew the guy," he said finally, his voice defensive. "Barely knew him, huh?" Whitman raised an eyebrow. "Funny, because we've got records of your truck being parked near Nebraska Hill the night he died, and we've got phone records showing quite a few calls between you and a certain Cassandra Moore leading up to that night." Jimmy's jaw tightened at the mention of Cassandra's name. "Look, Cassie, she didn't tell me anything. She just said she needed my help with something, all right, that's all." "Your help with what?" Jimmy's leg bounced faster. "I don't know, moving stuff or something. She said she'd pay me, that's all I know." Back in Cassandra's interrogation room, Wilson was wrapping up his initial questioning. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, and said, "One last thing, Miss Moore. Those scratch marks we found on the trail near the ledge, the ones consistent with someone being dragged, any idea how those got there?" Cassandra's breath hitched again, her mask of poise faltering ever so slightly. "Dragged?" she repeated, shaking her head. "No, I have no idea. What are you saying?" Wilson didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully closed the folder in front of him and stood. "Thank you for your time, Miss Moore," he said finally. "We'll be in touch." Cassandra nodded, the faintest trace of relief washing over her as she watched him leave. But as the door clicked shut behind Wilson, her polished composure faded for just a second, replaced by the flicker of something darker. Something that wasn't fear, it was the sharp edge of survival instincts kicking in. In the adjoining room, Detective Whitman wasn't letting Jimmy go so easily. "You're lying," she said bluntly, narrowing her eyes at him. "Cassandra's already told us plenty. And let me guess, she's going to paint this whole thing as your idea." Jimmy froze, his face pale. She wouldn't do that," he stammered. But even as the words left his lips, he could feel the weight of their emptiness. Cassandra would absolutely do that. "She already has," Whitman lied smoothly, watching his reaction. "You think she's sitting pretty in the other room? You're a loose end, Jimmy. She's selling you out as we speak." Jimmy's fists clenched on the table. That bitch!" he muttered under his breath, realization dawning on him. If there was one thing people like Jimmy Brown couldn't handle, it was the sense of being outplayed. And if Whitman knew anything, it was that desperation always revealed the cracks. At this point, the cracks between Cassandra's facade of innocence and Jimmy's shaky denials were about to grow wider. With every new detail brought forward, it became clear, neither of them could fully control the narrative anymore. The key evidence: fingerprints and personal devices. The Lancaster County Crime Lab was usually a quiet place, too clinical to resemble the chaotic crime shows on TV. But on July 18th, the hum of industrial equipment and the rattle of soda cans from vending machines were overshadowed by a growing sense of urgency. The clues found on Nebraska Hill had sparked one of the most serious investigations Sheriff Dan Wilson had handled in a decade, and the forensics team was doing everything they could to make it stick. In the middle of the laboratory, forensic analyst Jenna Flores eyed the soda can recovered from the trail with the care of someone defusing a bomb. The can sat under intense light, its surface carefully dusted with fine powder to reveal any potential fingerprints. Jenna leaned forward, squinting to check the faint markings that began to emerge. "Got something," she murmured to herself, her latex-gloved fingers steady as she carefully adjusted the lighting. She studied the partial print, a smudged, faint outline, but just enough of the ridge detail was intact. Minutes later, Jenna called into her headset, "Sheriff Wilson, you're going to want to see this." Wilson had been nursing his fifth cup of coffee in the station's break room when the call came through. "Flores," he responded, setting down the paper cup. "Yeah, the soda can, partial print found and matched," Jenna said on the other end, her voice brisk. Wilson immediately straightened. "Matched who?" "Cassandra Moore," she confirmed. A silence stretched on the line for a beat. "We cross-referenced it with her driver's license and employment records in the database. It's not just a close match. It's hers." "I'm on my way," Wilson replied, already grabbing his coat. As he headed out the door, he glanced at the board of evidence tagging the hallway. The soda can had been their first tangible lead, now it was officially pointing in Cassandra's direction. 15 minutes later, Wilson was back in the lab, standing next to Jenna. He stared at the fingerprint analysis results on her monitor, the ridged loops and arches unmistakably distinct. "Talk me through it," he said. His gravelly voice betrayed both exhaustion and resolve. Jenna gestured to the digital scan. The print had some smudging, likely from handling, but the recovery software cleaned up enough to give us clear identifiers. Cassandra Moore's right thumb, plain and simple. "And the residue inside?" he prompted. She nodded, switching screens to a chemical analysis report. "The substance in the soda can tested positive for a sedative compound. It's not your over-the-counter stuff either. This particular compound is used mostly in veterinary medicine. It's potent. Based on the concentration we found, this would have knocked out someone his size within minutes." Wilson rubbed his temple, feeling the full weight of the discovery. "Enough to impair him but not kill him instantly?" "Exactly," Jenna replied. "Assuming there were no other drugs or pre-existing conditions, it wouldn't cause immediate death, but if he was disoriented and near a dangerous area—" "Like the edge of Nebraska Hill," Wilson finished grimly. The picture was becoming clearer and darker. The fingerprint was only the beginning. While the forensics team focused on the physical evidence, another team had started digging into the digital footprint left behind by both Michael Brooks and Cassandra Moore. In today's world, the truth often hid in texts, emails, and social media posts. Sometimes that was where the loudest lies were. Detective Carol Whitman was the one spearheading the digital analysis. An old-school investigator with a modern tech-savvy streak, Whitman believed that you could learn a lot from what people tried to delete. Her first stop? Cassandra's phone records. Sitting in front of a monitor in her cramped office, Whitman tapped her pen against her desk as the data loaded. Subpoenaed phone records, courtesy of Cassandra's wireless carrier, started scrolling across the screen. Whitman scanned the numbers, timestamps, and durations, her brows furrowing as patterns emerged. "Bingo," she muttered under her breath, leaning closer. Cassandra's texts to Michael in the weeks leading up to his death were filled with affectionate clichés. "Can't wait to see you tonight," or "You're such a wonderful guy, Michael." But what really caught Whitman's attention was the sudden spike in calls and messages exchanged with one Jimmy Brown in the 3 days before July 15th. Whitman picked up the phone to brief the sheriff. "Dan, you're going to love this," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. "Lay it on me," Wilson replied. "Cassandra's been chatting with a certain Jimmy Brown more than anyone else. They exchanged a dozen calls on July 14th alone. This wasn't casual. And get this. His number pinged near Nebraska Hill the same night Michael took his fall. Cell tower logs confirm it." Wilson let out a slow exhale. "So now we've got Cassandra's fingerprint on the can and possible direct contact with someone on site that night." "Not just someone, an accomplice," Whitman pointed out. "Jimmy fits the profile of someone she could pull into this. He's got priors, low-level stuff, minor theft, bar fights, but he's the kind of guy who'd follow her lead if the price was right. Wilson was quiet for a moment, considering the growing pile of evidence. "What about Michael's phone?" he asked finally. "Working on it," Whitman replied. "It was badly damaged from the fall, but the techs are working on recovering data. If there's anything linking him to Cassandra's plan, we'll find it." By the next morning, the IT specialists in the tech lab struck gold. Michael's phone revealed its final haunting messages. One thread stood out, a chain of texts between him and Cassandra shortly before his death. Cassandra, 7:02 p.m. "Looking forward to dinner tonight. We need to talk about something important." Michael, 7:05 p.m. "Sure, is everything okay? You've been on my mind a lot lately." Cassandra, 7:08 p.m. "You'll see, just bring your sweet self. Maybe we can go somewhere quiet after. Nebraska Hill is beautiful this time of year." The timestamp of Cassandra's final message was less than 3 hours before Michael was found. It wasn't damning yet, it could be framed as innocence. But when paired with the fingerprint, the sedative, and the connection to Jimmy Brown, it became something far worse. Intent. Wilson and Whitman stared at the compiled evidence board in the briefing room. Red strings stretched from photos of Michael's shattered body to the soda can, to Cassandra's texts, and finally to Jimmy's phone records. Every new piece of evidence tightened the noose around Cassandra Moore. "She's not slipping out of this one," Whitman said confidently. Wilson crossed his arms. "No, but let's make sure the case is airtight before we bring her in. She's slippery, Carol. She planned this. I wouldn't be surprised if she's already rehearsing her next lie." Whitman smirked, tapping the board with her pen. "Don't worry, Dan. The best liars always trip over the truth." The physical evidence, the smudged fingerprint on the soda can, and the digital trail of deceit had aligned. Cassandra Moore might have thought she was untouchable, but the walls were closing in fast, and somewhere as they prepared their case against her, Jimmy Brown was likely watching it all unfold with growing dread. Because when the key evidence falls into place, there's no running from responsibility or the truth. The confession and cruel truth. The morning was dry and overcast, as if the skies themselves were holding their breath. Inside the Lancaster County Sheriff's Department, the walls reverberated with a tense energy. The investigation into Michael Brooks' death had reached a critical turning point. Both Cassandra Moore and Jimmy Brown had been separated for hours, each stewing in their respective interrogation rooms, playing mind games with whatever scenarios they believed the investigators might buy. Sheriff Dan Wilson, standing in the hallway outside Cassandra's room, rubbed the bridge of his nose. His colleague, Detective Carol Whitman, approached, holding a stack of reports that had been piling up over the last few days. "We've got her, Dan," Whitman said with uncharacteristic confidence. "The fingerprint, the damn drugged soda can, the texts, Jimmy's inconsistent babbling. There's no way she's wriggling out of this." Wilson nodded, staring through the two-way glass as Cassandra sat inside the room, motionless, her hands folded delicately on the table. "Yeah, we've got her," he said, almost to himself. "But she's clever. Calm, too calm. I need her to crack." He tugged at his shirt collar and muttered, "She reminds me of that Morrow case up in Omaha, remember? A full hour of denial until we dangled the right carrot and then boom, waterworks." Whitman smirked. "Except this one isn't going for waterworks. She'll fight tooth and nail. You better pace yourself." Wilson gave a resolute grunt before pushing open the door to Cassandra's room, where he found her exactly as she'd been for hours, too composed, too strategic. She didn't look up as he entered but shifted ever so slightly in her chair, signaling she recognized his presence. "Miss Moore," Wilson began, taking a seat across from her, his voice steady and purposeful. "We've been at this for a while now. You've told us your side of the story, but frankly—" He leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the table. His eyes bore into hers. "It doesn't add up." Cassandra raised her chin slightly, her lips curving faintly. Not quite a smile, but closer to defiance. "I've already said everything I know, Sheriff," she replied calmly. "Michael was a sweet guy, but I don't know what happened to him after we parted ways that night." "You don't know?" Wilson repeated, his voice sharpening. He opened the case file on the table between them and flipped through several damning pieces of evidence. A blown-up image of the soda can fingerprint, a chemical analysis of the veterinary sedative, the receipt from the bistro, and the recovered text between her and Michael. Cassandra's eyes flicked to the documents, but she remained silent. "Let's revisit the soda can, shall we?" Wilson said, tapping the photograph with his index finger. "Your fingerprint. Not someone else's, yours. And not just a smudge either. It's clear enough we know exactly which hand you used, so—" What was it doing there? Her carefully controlled expression wavered for just a second before she slid back behind the cool exterior. I might have handed it to him, she said softly. We were hiking. Maybe I dropped it. People touch things, Sheriff. It's not exactly a crime. Wilson gave her a long, pointed look. It is, he replied evenly. If the soda's laced with a sedative strong enough to knock out a grown man, and that man, Michael, was last seen with you before he conveniently ended up dead at the bottom of a cliff. Cassandra exhaled deeply, her shoulders sagging slightly as though performing weariness for him. I don't know how... She started but stopped herself, her voice trailing off deliberately, as if waiting for Wilson to fill in the blanks. Instead, Wilson leaned back in his chair and let the silence fill the room. Good investigators knew when to press, and when to let suspects stew in their own discomfort. Eventually Cassandra shifted in her seat, her polished facade beginning to chip. You think I killed Michael, don't you? She asked, her voice softer now, carrying the faintest hint of amusement. Do you even hear yourself? The Michael I knew wouldn't have hurt a fly. He was sweet and harmless. What motive could I possibly have? Oh, we've got plenty of motive, Wilson said, casually pulling out one stark image, a bank statement they'd been able to retrieve from Michael's phone. Looks like Michael had some savings built up. Nice chunk of change for someone living modestly. And from what we hear, you've been in a bit of financial trouble recently. Clients drying up at the salon, rent overdue. Sound familiar, or do I need to keep going? Cassandra's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She didn't answer. Wilson continued, his voice harder now. Here's what I think happened, Cassandra. I think you went after Michael because he was soft. The kind of guy who liked to help people. The kind of guy who'd empty his savings if you cried hard enough. And when that didn't work fast enough, well... He gestured toward the evidence again. You brought him out to Nebraska Hill, made him feel special, let him think you cared, and then you made sure he couldn't tell anyone what you did? That's ridiculous, she said quickly, her words a little sharper now. You're spinning a story that doesn't exist. I wasn't even... You weren't even what? Wilson interrupted, leaning forward again. You weren't even at Nebraska Hill? Because we've got texts, timestamps, cell tower pings, all leading straight to you. And let's not forget your buddy Jimmy. Wilson watched her reaction carefully. Oh yeah, Jimmy's been talking. Trouble is he can't seem to decide whether he's blaming you or playing dumb. Either way, he's hanging you out to dry. A flicker of panic crossed Cassandra's face, but she smothered it quickly, her voice sharpening again. Jimmy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a nobody, an idiot. That idiot just might seal your fate, Wilson said sharply, his voice hardening with each word. He let it sink in before continuing. You think Jimmy's going to stay loyal to you? He's been sweating bullets since the second we brought him in. And from where I sit, it looks like he's ready to throw you under the bus to save his own neck. Meanwhile, in the other interrogation room, Jimmy Brown wasn't holding out as well as Cassandra. He'd been pacing against the tiled floor, his face pallid and glistening with sweat, while Detective Whitman waited him out. All right, Jimmy, she said finally, her voice razor-sharp. Put a name to the person who handed you the plan. Was it Cassandra? Or are you really going to make me believe this was all your idea? Jimmy thumped his fists against the table. It was her, all right. It was all her. She planned every second of it. His voice cracked with desperation. I didn't want to do it. She made me. She said we just needed to scare him, take the money and run. I didn't know she was going to... You know... Whitman crossed her arms. Dump him over a cliff? Jimmy winced at the words, swallowing hard. It wasn't supposed to be like that. And the sedative? She pressed him. His head dropped into his hands. She brought it, he muttered, barely above a whisper. Said it'd make things easier. She's the one with all the ideas. She's the one who makes people do things. Back in Cassandra's room, Wilson stood and loomed over the table. That's it, Cassandra. Jimmy's done covering for you, and the evidence is airtight. The drug, the prints, the texts, the money. You think a jury's not going to see through all your lies? The question now is whether you want to go down lying or go down bargaining. For the first time, Cassandra hesitated. Her mask cracked just a little more. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her mind whirring. Wilson leaned in one last time, his voice low and cold. Let me tell you something, Miss Moore. Everybody breaks, even the clever ones like you. And in that moment, Cassandra let out a shaky breath, her perfectly curated poise collapsing under the mountain of evidence. Fine, she whispered, her eyes flashing with a sharp, bitter light. You want the truth? Michael was an idiot. All he wanted was love, and people like him are easy to hurt. He had something I wanted, and he was too blind to see what I really was. If he just handed it over, none of this would have happened. She leaned back, her voice dripping with venom now. "But no one in this world gets anywhere by playing it nice. Don't look at me like I'm a monster, Sheriff. I'm just smarter than the rest of you." Cruel, calculated, and finally confessing. The final verdict. The courtroom was packed that day. The air inside buzzed with a tangible tension, thick enough to choke on. Reporters sat elbow to elbow at the back of the gallery, their notepads poised and cameras ready to capture even the subtlest shifts in Cassandra Moore's expression. Rows of townspeople lined the wooden benches, whispering among themselves in fragmented rumors and speculation about what the final moments in this sensational trial would bring. To many, this wasn't just about Michael Brooks' untimely death, it was about uncovering the depth of human cruelty and calculating deception. Seated at the defense table, Cassandra radiated the same stoic composure she had adopted since her arrest. Even in her orange prison uniform, she held herself with an eerie grace, her posture immaculate, her expression unreadable. She stared ahead at the judge's bench, ignoring the simmering hostility emanating from the crowd behind her. She was no longer the charming salon owner everyone had admired. To them she was now something far darker, the monster who had manipulated, betrayed, and ultimately killed a man who loved her. The prosecution and defense teams had sparred for weeks, a legal dance of evidence and deflection that gripped the nation. The key witnesses, including Jimmy Brown, testified to Cassandra's cold, calculating nature. Forensic experts addressed the damning fingerprint on the soda can, the presence of the veterinary sedative, and the deliberate staging of Michael's fall. Even her texts with Michael, those seemingly affectionate threads, painted her as a woman who meticulously orchestrated his death. But the showstopper of the trial was Cassandra herself. Her moments on the stand were haunting, to say the least. Flashback to Cassandra's time on the stand. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Howards stood tall before the jury, her piercing voice commanding the room. "Miss Moore," she began, pacing the floor slowly, her heels clicking against the marble tile. "You're telling us that Michael just, what? Decided to take himself to a cliffside for a romantic stroll and then accidentally tumbled off? Is that the narrative you're asking these 12 jurors to believe?" Cassandra tilted her head slightly, her blonde curls framing her face. Her voice was smooth, intentional. "People do unpredictable things, Miss Howards. Michael was overwhelmed, emotional. I cared about him, but I couldn't control his choices." "And yet," Howards pressed, raising an eyebrow, "you controlled just about everything else, didn't you?" She strode back to the evidence table, picking up an enlarged photograph of the soda can. "For instance, this can, clearly marked with your fingerprint, laced with a sedative strong enough to disorient any grown man. Tell me, Miss Moore, do you always drug the people you care about?" Cassandra blinked slowly, her shoulders stiffening. "I didn't drug Michael," she said firmly, the softness in her voice evaporating into icy resolve. "I handed him the soda, that's true, but whatever was in it, I didn't put it there." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Howards laughed, mirthlessly, shaking her head. "Let me guess," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Jimmy Brown did it. Because according to your testimony, everything was his fault. The staging, the drugs, the dragging, the fall, it was always him." "That's because it was him," Cassandra snapped, the first noticeable crack in her calm demeanor. "Jimmy's unstable. He'd do anything for money. He twisted this entire thing to make me look guilty." Howards leaned in, her tone sharpening. "Funny how he says the exact same thing about you, Miss Moore. But let's get to the heart of the matter. You knew about Michael's savings, didn't you? You knew he'd do anything for you. Empty his bank account if you asked. But that wasn't enough. You didn't just want his money. You wanted his silence." Cassandra's lips parted as if she were about to protest, but she hesitated. Instead, she shifted her gaze toward her attorney, searching for an invisible lifeline. The jury's eyes followed every flicker of emotion on her face, studying her with a mix of suspicion and fascination. But her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said, the moment of the verdict. Weeks of deliberation finally led to this moment. Judge Eleanor Hanover strode into the courtroom, her black robe billowing slightly as she climbed the steps to her bench. She was a seasoned judge, elegant and authoritative, with a reputation for delivering unflinching justice. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the crowd stood, their collective intake of breath audible. The jury filed in next, their faces stoic, guarded. The foreman, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit, clutched the sheet of paper that carried the weight of Cassandra's fate. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Hanover asked, her voice steady. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his expression unreadable as he handed the paper to the bailiff. The judge accepted it, reading the contents with a slight lift of her brow before addressing the courtroom. In the case of the People versus Cassandra Moore, on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant. She paused, scanning the room. The weight of her words hung oppressively in the air. Guilty. The gallery erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Michael Brooks' family clung to one another, a raw mix of grief and relief visible on their tear-streaked faces. Cassandra, however, remained remarkably still. Her lips tightened slightly, but her eyes stayed locked on the judge, calculating, unreadable. "Order!" Judge Hanover barked, her gavel striking like thunder against the heavy wooden block. The room quieted, though the tension remained electric. The judge turned her attention back to Cassandra. "Miss Moore, you've been found guilty of murder in the first degree. Your calculated actions, your callous disregard for human life, and your deliberate manipulation of the victim all paint a chilling picture of heartlessness. You deceived a man who trusted you, crafted a premeditated plan to take his life, and attempted to cover it up with disturbing precision." She took a deep breath before delivering the final sentence. "It is the judgment of this court that you, Cassandra Moore, are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection." The gallery erupted again, a wave of whispers, cheers, and gasps crashing over the courtroom. Cassandra's defense attorney's shoulders slumped as if the wind had been knocked out of him. But Cassandra herself barely flinched. Her face remained a mask, a tight, frozen exterior that betrayed none of the terror she must have felt. As she was escorted out, shackles clinking against the tiled floor, she cast a single, lingering glance over her shoulder. If there was fear in her eyes, it was fleeting. Instead, what lingered was something colder, something resigned to fate, yet still filled with quiet defiance. Jimmy Brown's sentencing. Though Jimmy Brown had escaped the death penalty by cooperating with authorities, his freedom was never a possibility. A week after Cassandra's conviction, Jimmy stood in the same courtroom, hands trembling as Judge Hanover addressed him. "Mr. Brown," she began, "while your cooperation significantly helped the prosecution, that does not absolve you of your role in this heinous crime. You acted as an accomplice to murder, aided in its staging, and only came forward out of self-preservation. For this the court has no choice but to hold you accountable." His sentence was pronounced, life in prison without the possibility of parole. As two officers led him out of the courtroom, Jimmy's shoulders hunched under the weight of his actions. He wasn't defiant like Cassandra. He was broken, shaking, a man who knew he had walked willingly into the darkness and would never walk back out. A legacy of betrayal. The case of the People versus Cassandra Moore reverberated through Lancaster County for years to come. In hushed tones, people spoke of the lengths Cassandra went to for greed, her ability to manipulate those around her with precise cruelty. For Michael Brooks's family, the verdict brought bittersweet closure but not healing. Michael died because he trusted her, his sister Megan said during a televised interview weeks after the trial. And that's the worst kind of evil, the kind that preys on love. In prison, Cassandra awaited her final fate, becoming a cautionary tale for those who believed they could outsmart the system, because no matter how carefully crafted the plan, justice, though delayed, always has the final word.